Greetings. One of the areas that I think is sometimes neglected in serial murder material, courses, research, is serial murders by children and adolescents. And part of that may simply be that it is such a rare event. But what I'd like to do is to turn to Dr. Meyer's 2004 article, Serial Murder by Children and Adolescents, from Behavioral Sciences and the Law, volume 22, pages 357 to 374. And so this article by Dr. Myers provides excellent case studies for our analysis and to see how this fits in with some of our theories and some of our other cases that we've studied, for example, of adults. And first, Dr. Myers points out that there are different definitions of serial murder, and we've already discussed that debate and that being one of the main problems in the field is, we really need to have a agreed upon definition. But in these cases that are reviewed, that the cases were considered to be serial murders if the juvenile committed a second homicide unrelated to the first while still under the age of 18. And also they looked Dr. Myers looked at the need or an indicator that there was some sadistic needs that were being gratified as part of the killing. And these are also considered sexual homicides in ways that relate to both, or I should say multiple factors, the psychological, biological, social, and family. But the common theme that runs throughout these cases is sadistic fantasy. I'll go back for a couple of minutes here, and as I mentioned, I worked as a clinician in forensic mental health settings for a while before going into teaching. I do remember one case I interviewed a 6-year-old male who had been sexually abused by his mother's friend. And when I interviewed him, he told me that he was going to kill the abuser. And I asked him how he was going to do that. And he told me that he was going to get a gun and he was going to shoot and kill the abuser. And I tried to go into detail to find out. I mean, maybe he had access to a gun. I don't know. But he did inform me that he was too small right now to kill the offender, and when he got bigger and stronger, then he would do that. Of course, one of the goals in that therapeutic setting is for him to not act out aggressively. And but the whole idea, would a 6-year-old actually pick up a gun and shoot the offender? Would he? And I can't answer that. What I can say that as far as I know, at least following the case for a year, he did not kill anybody. And I never heard anything since. So I would assume that didn't happen. But the whole idea there, comes into play. And this is extremely different than some of these other cases, although there also may be some similarities. One of the things that was not present was sadistic fantasy. Basically, my understanding from interviewing the child was that he wanted to kill the abuser so the abuser would never be able to abuse him or anyone else. And that's different than the cases we're studying here. The big 10 factors that are discussed right away related to child-adolescent serial murder: lack of guilt, having neurological problems, brain-based problems, school problems, being a victim of abuse, whether that's sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological or emotional abuse, neglect, or a combination of those. Also other family problems and violence, having had previous arrests, having sadistic fantasies, having psychopathy, and also having a personality disorder. And so you kind of see that some of these factors actually overlap. Obviously, violence and previous arrests, or school problems. Some of these abuse, family problems, overlap somewhat. So it might be difficult to say that these are totally independent, but these are some factors that we look at. And also the lack of guilt, psychopathy, personality disorder, that kind of school problems, that kind of comes into play with conduct disorder from a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5 perspective. And so we might say, mental disorders are present. And then we get into the case examples, and you all have access to the PowerPoint, which our teaching assistant was kind enough to put together for us. And so you can get a lot more details with the PowerPoint. And if you really want to get a lot more details about these cases, then you can go to the UCF online library and you can get the article itself. The first case is JP, was born in Boston in the mid-1800s, lived in a very abusive household, and also was described as a loner with mood swings. So JP might actually have had some kind of disorder there in terms of mood. He began his criminal activity at a very young age, and part of that involved torturing animals. He also took his victims to isolated locations where he would have them take off their clothes and then he would beat them. And he also masturbated during the assaults and while he stabbed or cut his victims. In 1872, he was caught and placed in a house of reformation, and then he was released for good behavior after 18 months. And after his release, he killed a young girl, and then he was sentenced to life. And so here you see a case where you see some of the Big Ten come into play here. And also, what's interesting is that he had 18 months of good behavior leading to his release, and sometimes, and that's when we see sometimes in cases where the person seems to be quite normal. In this case, he did not appear because of what was reported, but in some of the cases that we study of serial murders, they tend to fit in fine. A couple cases I was just reviewing for a paper I'm working on, they're involved in multi-level marketing. They're involved in politics. They were involved in, charity organizations. They had wives. They had kids. And so, and I've talked before to, children of serial murderers, and they were shocked by everything too. That it came as a great surprise, and so many times the person is able to pass as being a nonviolent everyday citizen. JP's case, no, there were all kinds of warnings that there were problems. The next case, WH, was a male born in Chicago during the 1920s. And in this case, he was provided a great deal of sexual and miseducation from his mother. He must have been fairly intelligent since he was admitted to the University of Chicago at age 16. And he found engaging in criminal activity was sexually arousing, and at age 16 he murdered a woman, and he found that to be very arousing. And he also then murdered a second woman, and then he murdered a 6-year-old child and also dismembered her and left a ransom note. And he was eventually caught, and he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, but he still received 3 life sentences. So sometimes, in this case, you have someone who seems relatively intelligent, but has all these other problems going on regarding sexuality and relationships. MB is an interesting case because MB was a female born in England in the 1950s. Again, an emotionally and physically abusive home. Her mother was a prostitute, and on MB's 11th birthday, she killed a 4-year-old boy. She also, several months later, strangled a 3-year-old boy and carved her initials into his stomach and also skinned his penis. And she was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to life, and with the possibility of release if her psychopathic personality was cured. Remember, this was in the 1950s, so a lot of times treatments, interventions, sentences, all that are different than in today's criminal justice mental health world. And she was released in 1980 at the age of 23. That would be an interesting case if we could follow up on that. I believe MB changed her name and tried to blend into society, so I don't know what MB has been up to since then. But that's kind of interesting that she was released at age 23, although she was very, very young when she was sentenced. The case of BB focuses on a 15-year-old breaking into homes, and he killed one of his teachers, and he drowned an older female in the bathtub while also sexually abusing her. And he was arrested when he was caught looking in windows. So he also was a voyeur, engaged in voyeurism. And so again, you see a lot of the deviant sexual practices and behaviors. The case of WB, he began killing at age 16. And in this case, he tortured his victims. And for example, with one boy, he broke both his legs. He also engaged in masturbation during the killings. And he was sentenced to life in prison, plus 50 years for one of the homicides and 100 years for a kidnapping torture case. GA was born in another country in 1982, and at a young age he joined a gang and became very violent, and he killed a girlfriend who refused his sexual advances, and then he was convicted of 7 murders and suspected in 10 others, so quite a prolific serial murderer. And he went to prison, escaped from prison, and was recaptured. So again, interesting case to look at. Now, even though it's a very small sample size, and one of the things relates to how do we make sense of what all the major themes are going on here. And the author states that really what we need to focus here on is the pursuit of, quote, pursuit of sadistic pleasure, end of quote, as one of the major motivating factors. So this author believes that sadistic pleasure is one of the major motivating factors related to the adolescent engaged in serial murder in these cases. It also provides us with some evidence of risks that we might want to address. Now, going back, I want to mention before I wrap up this video regarding the big 10 factors. If there's a few of those factors present with people, doesn't mean they're going to become serial killers. Even if all of those are present, it doesn't mean that they're going to become serial killers, and that is important to recognize. There's not really a checklist, and so we also want to avoid labeling individuals who may have some of these so-called risk factors, and then thinking that they're going to lead a life of criminal activity, because that may not be the case at all. But what we want to do is assist them at an early age and as soon as possible. And that brings me back the whole way to the 6-year-old child that I interviewed. In that case, I was able to get him immediate therapy, the family immediate therapy, and intervention right away. And so that, I think, was important. But it would be extremely problematic if I was unable to get him any assistance or help. And so sometimes we have to wonder, do we sometimes lose cases that fall through the cracks of our systems? Or do we, have cases where instead of helping, our reaction and system actually may do more harm? So there's a lot of these hard questions we have to ask whenever we come up with an intervention. What is in the best interest of, in these cases, the child or the adolescent? And I'm talking about prior to the child or adolescent engaging in criminal or illegal behavior or activity. So I've seen a lot of cases referred by the school system, by other mental health professionals, where children, adults are engaging in violent behavior. And one of the things that I think is important, again, is that we have enough funding not only to study adolescents and children who have violent-related problems, but also to look at programs or interventions or treatments that have been shown with research to actually reduce the risk and to work with those cases. But I thought I would bring this article in because it was a rare find, really, in that regard, and I thought would be of interest to the course. Thank you.